Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I leave the house for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, welcome to the first episode of Pick Up and Deliver since my kids got out of school and I no longer have a regular walk to do during the summer. I'm not sure, judging by this first week, how often I'm going to be recording, but I'm going to try to get into a regular habit and hold to my 2 episodes a week that I've been doing. So regular listener Chris Hickman tagged me in a conversation on Board Game Geek, or on Facebook, about a blog. So I will link to the blog post, so if you'd like to read for yourself the more insightful commentary that I'm going to give. This is on the blog post, The Crock Pot, and the title of the post is One versus Many, Game Night Quantity. Basically, the author was, and I couldn't find the name of the author. I guess if I'd looked around more carefully, I could. I'll put the link in the show notes so you can find it yourself. The author was basically thinking through the two sides of the discussion about, is a game night better if you play a bunch of shorter games or 1 or 2 longer games? That was sort of the essential question. And I think the author kind of comes to the same conclusion that we all have to, which is that there is no right or wrong answer about how many games you would play on a game night, but rather it sort of goes to your preference. So I guess I was thinking about that in reflection of particularly the game night I had with my wife and my 2 neighbors the other night. It was a really fun time, but we ended up only playing 1 game because it ran longer than we expected. And while that's great, and we enjoyed the game, I think the best point the author of The Crock Pot made was if you don't like the game, there's a lot of risk in a single long game experience. If you aren't enjoying it, then you're kind of stuck. Board game etiquette certainly does not allow for people to just quit in the middle, especially if the game is built around how many players are in the game. Quitting in the middle is often pretty rude, which means you're stuck playing a game you're not enjoying for a really long time. I think that is the best critique of the single long game argument I've seen. That said, for me, the ideal game night is more about the possibilities. Right, so when I have, and let's say I have a whole evening to play games with my family, even when that's the case, the heaviest we're going to get is whatever my wife is willing to play, which is generally sort of mid-weight games. She likes Wingspan, she likes London. I'd say London's a little heavier than Wingspan, but that's probably about as heavy as she enjoys. She certainly doesn't want to play anything that's heavier than that, or hasn't really enjoyed those games up to now. So when I go to, say, my game group, and I have the opportunity to write ahead of time and arrange for a more complicated or longer game that I'm going to play over the course of several hours, to me that is a good night spent, because it's the opportunity that I have, that I'm making the most of this chance where I have several like-minded gamers who want to play a game of similar weight and length, as opposed to when I'm sort of flying by the seat of my pants or doing sort of pick-up board games. Invariably, those end up being shorter because it's harder to jump into a game with people and then suddenly be in a 3-hour game. It's harder to all agree that you're going to spend that kind of time. If you're playing with people you don't know and you haven't sort of pre-vetted, there's always the danger that they won't really like it. Last time I played Cerebria, one of the players, they all did fine, but one of the players didn't really seem to enjoy it, and he had to leave early because of his work. And I feel like a big part of that was just that he had to work, sure, but I think that maybe he didn't enjoy the game or wasn't into it as much. It's hard to tell, but the complexities, the risk in trying to play a longer game, I think, are more difficult if you're doing a sort of pickup experience. Context, of course, makes a big difference as well. at a gaming group or a board gaming day, you can assume most people there have some level of board game experience. If you're at a more public event and there's a board gaming thing, maybe you can't assume the same level of experience. As a side corollary, I've been thinking about there's a kind of difficulty in figuring out levels of experience for the people you're playing games with, because it's very hard to ask. I've discovered that is a tricky thing, actually, to figure out how much experience someone has as a gamer without being rude or presumptive. Certainly, I don't like to have someone sit down at the game table and assume I don't know anything about games. And I don't like to do that to other people. At the same time, a great way to make a terrible gaming experience is to get somebody who's relatively new to gaming or relatively light on gaming and throw them into a really heavy board game that they're not really ready to play, because then they have a terrible time. They have trouble tracking what's going on or figuring out how to play well, and then they also don't have a good time. So it can be kind of tricky to figure out what level someone is at a gamer without asking them questions that could ultimately appear rude. I mean, one of the ways I did with Three Bears, I said, so you enjoy heavier games, right? This is a pretty complex one. He's like, yeah. And I said, okay. And I honestly, like I said, it was a new player that I didn't know before, so I don't really know whether he was enjoying it or not. And he wasn't overtly saying he didn't like it, but he also wasn't overtly saying, oh, this game is great, which is something I often do when I'm playing a new game, especially with new people. I'll express my delight in a game quite verbally. I know it's hard for you to believe. I might tell strangers what I'm thinking, but there it is. So I find that part of a game night is more likely to reward a shorter game, because I think everybody has the attention span for a 45 to 60 minute game if you're going to play games at a game night. And if a game is too complex for somebody, they get an out within 45 minutes, and so then you can suggest something else that's lighter. Versus if you lean the other way, if you lean into heavier games, then it's harder to get out, and longer games often suffer from that situation as well. That said, I also find a lot of pleasure in playing a series of short games. As the Crockpot outlines, there are a lot of advantages to this. One is that you get more chances to win. You get more chances to engage in different kinds of play. And if you haven't figured out yet, I am definitely a cult of the new kind of guy. I really enjoy playing a new game I haven't played before and sort of experiencing the ins and outs of whatever that game has to offer. In a longer game, you get to experience the ins and outs of one game, but you don't get that wider survey of possibilities that you would get from a series of shorter games. You also, like I said, if you lose, you've lost the only game you're playing that night, which maybe isn't as fun as well, especially if you're somebody who is really motivated by winning, which is not something that I would say about myself. So overall, to sum up, I think I would lean toward, I prefer a single long game to a series of short games. I like the depth of the deeper experience that the narrative can provide. For instance, I really enjoy Time Stories when we're able to sit down and play the whole Time Stories chapter in one sitting. That the 4 or 5 hours that provides creates a shared narrative experience that just far exceeds the game experience of a shorter game. That can, again, mean that it's less exciting or it's kind of disappointing if it turns out that narrative experience isn't great. The couple times that the Time Stories chapters haven't been stellar have been particularly frustrating to have spent 5 hours on and then not really get much in return. So I've got a minute or two here before I'm done with this episode. So like I said, this is going to be a bit weird in terms of publishing this summer. I'm not sure what my walking schedule is going to be, and then we're traveling a bit here and there, so I may not publish that much in the next month or so. Apologies in advance. We'll see what the next couple weeks look like. If I can get a few episodes kind of in the tank, I can spread those out so that you'll still get some content into July as I go places with my family and step away from the internet a little bit. So I guess during this last minute here, I did want to mention I'm really excited to see what kinds of games come out at Origins and at Gen Con, but I haven't really been doing very much to study what those games are. I've mentioned a few times I'm going to try to be a bit more thrifty about purchasing new games. So part of that is going to be not watching the new hits quite as aggressively, because if I'm not paying attention to the new games that come out, it's easier to avoid what the Secret Cabal calls that junkie fever, that idea that, oh man, I really want to have that game, and ooh, there's a great game that I want. That said, I almost invariably want the new things that come out, and I'm sure that the podcasts I listen to will continue to cover Origins at Gen Con, and so I will hear about those new things that come out. Right now, the top of the stack that's really exciting me is, or the top of the list, they have a commercial game about Jaws coming out from Target, or it's going to be Target exclusive in late June, and then it'll be available wider on August 1st. Pretty tempted by that, because you know that Jaws is one of my favorite movies. Shark Island was not great, but I'd be interested to see what a new approach to Jaws did, and intrigued to see where they go with that. Well, what are you working on this summer? How do you feel about game night? Do you prefer a big heavy game or a bunch of smaller games? Pop over to the Board Game Geek thread, Guild 3269, about this episode and contribute your thoughts, or you could go to the blog that originally posted their thoughts and contribute the conversation there. In the meantime, I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.